Welcome to an entry that was never meant to be heard. Again. Night drop, July 9th, 1943. Wind over the olive fields was heavier than expected. Men scattered beyond the rally point. Heard something moving among the rocks. Not gunfire. Something heavier. Extract from the Field Journal of Private James R. Alcott, and Airborne Division. Recovered from the estate papers of Colonel H.B. Morrison, U.S. Army Airborne Command, Fort Bragg Archives, 1956. At 02:17, after first contact with local shepherds, a series of distress signals were recorded on SCR 300 Channel 9. Transmission ended with the word, claws. No subsequent radio traffic. Excerpt, Signal Corps, After Action Debrief, Operation Husky. Drop Zone West, filed August 1943. An Italian farmer interviewed in 1947 described it differently. The sky tore open with silk. The men fell like white moths. One landed near the vineyard. Then came the noise not from the air, from the ground. Oral history, collected by anthropologist Pietro Mariani, Archivio delle Tradizioni Popolari di Palermo, volume 2. In another set of field notes, an unnamed war correspondent scribbled one incomplete line before his notebook was water-damaged. They said it had eyes that caught the flare light, like mirrors under the soil. None of these fragments were ever cross-referenced. No full casualty list matches the missing personnel from Drop Zone West. The records stop mid-sentence as if the paper itself refused to continue. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you paused. What did you feel in that silence? The entries you have just heard are preserved in scattered repositories across 3 nations. None belong to the same collection. The first, a torn journal leaf from Private James R. Alcott, was catalogued in 1956 during a clearance of personal effects held by the family of Colonel Henry B. Morrison. The handwriting, verified by 2 separate analysts at the National Archives in Maryland, matches Alcott's known training forms from Fort Benning, 1942. The ink, according to a 1963 chemical test, contains traces of Sicilian soil rich in iron oxide. That soil composition occurs only in the western coastal ridge near Gela, the sector designated Drop Zone West. Operation Husky. The Allied invasion of Sicily began on July 9, 1943. Weather reports confirm violent crosswinds over the southern coastline that night. Paratroopers of the 505th and 504th Regiments of the 82nd Airborne Division were dispersed over a 40-mile radius. Official debriefs note confusion, misdrops, and unexpected environmental interference. Yet nowhere in those files does the term environmental interference appear again. The phrase exists only once, typed in uppercase, unelaborated, on the final line of an internal memorandum, classified Region Caltanissetta, supplemental. 2 years later, a field researcher named Captain Edward M. Reeves of the U.S. Graves Registration Service attempted to locate Alcott's remains. Reeves's mission report, declassified in 1982, includes a short annotation, recovered 2 parachute harnesses, no skeletal remains. Local reports of nocturnal digging sounds in the vineyard area. Reeves was later reassigned to France. His subsequent correspondence mentions recurring nightmares and a persistent sense of movement in the soil. These letters are housed at the U.S. Army Military History Institute, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The oral history collected by anthropologist Pietro Mariani in 1947 originated during the Rural Reconstruction Folklore Survey of post-war Sicily. Mariani's handwritten notebook, stored in Palermo's Regional Folklore Archive, references rumors among shepherd families of the Salemi Plain. His entry on July 14th reads, "They speak of men who fell from the night sky and awoke something old. The elders will not name it directly, but they gesture toward the hills where the wind never stops." Mariani's assistant, Giulia De Luca, later annotated the margin. Avoid further interviews in this region. Locals refuse to travel after dusk. No complete transcript of Mariani's recordings survives. The original wire reels were destroyed in a 1951 warehouse fire. Only his partial transcriptions remain uneven, smudged by moisture. The legibility decreases precisely where the testimonies shift from war description to rural superstition. A single page ends mid-sentence, and when they saw its hand, they realized it was not a hand. Among military archives, one related signal report corroborates the timing. The 82nd Airborne's SCR 300 radio logs record a burst transmission at 02:17 containing the word claws. Communications historian Lieutenant David P. Rowe reviewed this anomaly in 1949 while compiling post-combat radio errors of the European theater. Rowe's marginalia note, transmission integrity verified. Code word, clause not in standard lexicon, possibly literal. Rowe died in a vehicle collision in 1951 near Gela, the same coastal highway where Reeves once searched for remains. His personal field notes have since gone missing. Italian civilian reports from July 10th to 12th, 1943 describe strange animal cries and earth trembling in the hills east of Trapani. The Carabinieri filed these as air raid illusions caused by shelling. Yet artillery logs show no bombardment within 20 kilometers of those villages on the nights in question. A later agricultural inspection discovered collapsed burrows and unidentifiable tracks of 5 points irregular spacing depth, consistent with a bipedal gait. Measurements were entered on Form AGR B112, now lost. The carbon copy survives only because it was mailed to Rome for statistical tabulation. The pattern of documentation itself is disquieting official sources, fragment exactly where folklore begins. Each archive hands the thread to another military, to civilian, to academic, to oral retelling, as if none wished to be the one to conclude. This fragmentation gives the impression not of absence but of refusal. In 1974, a researcher from King's College London, Dr. Harold Linton, conducted a comparative study titled Anomalous Wartime Testimonies in Mediterranean Theaters. Linton noted that Mariani's notes share structural parallels with early 20th century Corsican burial legends, particularly the motif of the buried voice, a recurring superstition involving soldiers hearing speech from beneath the earth after battles. Linton requested access to the U.S. Signal Corps files on Operation Husky. His inquiry was acknowledged but unanswered. 2 years later, Linton vanished while conducting fieldwork in the Sicilian interior. His last known letter, dated June 1976, ends. The soil is still breathing. One microfilm spool labeled Mariani Collection Supplement B was rediscovered in 1989 by archivist Lucia Ferrante during a routine audit. The reel contained only ambient audio, wind insects, distant bells. At the 23-minute mark, a male voice speaks a single phrase in Sicilian dialect, ancora scava, meaning it still digs. The authenticity of the voice remains contested. Ferrante filed an internal memo noting that the tape leader carried the faint imprint of the American Signal Corps emblem, suggesting it had been reused. From these intersecting sources emerges a narrow corridor of certainty. The drop occurred July 9th, 1943. A cluster of paratroopers was lost west of Gela. A radio transmission included the word claws. Civilian witnesses reported tremors and sounds. Recovery missions found equipment without bodies. Beyond those points, evidence becomes spectral, each record acknowledging the previous one only indirectly. None offers explanation, all defer. A brief note in the 1959 Army Quartermaster Journal mentions persistent rumors of subsurface interference with airborne operations, but lists no case references. The author, Colonel John H. Perkins, retired immediately after publication. He later wrote privately to a colleague that the article had been heavily edited for political reasons, and that the Sicilian matter was better left beneath the ground. When historians at the University of Palermo revisited Mariani's fieldwork in 1997, they found that his assistant, Giulia De Luca, had emigrated to Argentina in 1950. She left behind one sealed envelope labeled Non aprire mai per la tua sicurezza. Never open for your safety. Inside was a page torn from Mariani's original ledger, containing coordinates and a single English phrase written in foreign handwriting. They came up in silence. No records indicate who wrote it. The handwriting does not match Mariani De Luca or any known member of their team. Forensic comparison in 2003 suggested it belonged to an adult male educated in the United States mid-20th century. In 2009, historian Alessio Venti attempted to compile a digital database cross-referencing U.S. and Italian sources on airborne anomalies during Operation Husky. The resulting dataset produced one repeating gap, a missing 11-minute segment of radio frequency recording from Channel 9 between 02:16 and 02:27. The military archives classify this omission as signal saturation electromagnetic distortion. Civilian technicians who reviewed the waveform patterns reported low-frequency oscillations resembling rhythmic movement rather than static. Taken together, these elements outline a history that resists completion. The human signatures, Alcott's inked words, Reeves's letters, Mariani's notebooks, Linton's disappearance orbit a central absence. Each name enters the record to pursue a question and exits without an answer. In compiling these fragments, one is left with a faint impression that the documentation itself has a pulse pages unearthed decades apart, always damp, always unfinished. The archivists who touch them remark on the same faint odor of wet stone. The remaining uncertainty is not merely academic. It touches the boundary between report and remembrance, between the empirical and the murmured. Somewhere along that line lies a question not yet articulated, whether those who fell over Sicily met the enemy they were briefed for, or something that predated briefing uniform and language alike. And the researcher who first sought to reconcile them, Captain Reeves, was last recorded traveling the same unpaved road near Gela in 1945. The field log ends with his final observation. The ground has started to move again. He never arrived at base. His jeep was found empty, ignition on engine cold. The field worker who recorded this testimony vanished 2 years later on the same road. In August 1943, scarcely 3 weeks after the initial drop over western Sicily, the 82nd Airborne submitted an internal memorandum to the Office of Strategic Services concerning localized psychological disturbances among surviving paratroopers. The document described recurring dreams shared by men from separate platoons, each reporting the same impression movement beneath soil, followed by a metallic odor and sudden vertigo. The line "no further action required" closes every entry. Attached medical forms list the cause as combat fatigue with somatic overlay. None of the men who later died in their sleep were autopsied. Decades afterward, Sicilian shepherds on the Sicily plain preserved a version of the event that never reached Washington. They spoke of men who dug with their boots as if hearing a drum below. The pasture where they fell became known as Campo del Dormiente, the field of the sleeper. According to those who still tell it, the earth refused rest after those nights. Sheep avoided the groves and dogs barked not at the air, but the ground itself. The legend insists the soldiers brought back something that remembered hunger. A surviving letter from Sergeant Walter J. Cray, dated August 18, 1943, adds a small piece to the same map. He wrote to his wife in Philadelphia about finding an uncharted tunnel system north of Gela. The Army's censorship division intercepted the letter and filed it away under miscellaneous restricted correspondence. Cray's words end abruptly. We followed the sound, thinking it was one of ours trapped below, but the tunnels were old stone laid like Roman work. They went too deep for lights. A week later, his name appeared on the casualty list, caused structural collapse. In village memory, from that same terrain, an elderly woman named Fiorella di Campo recalled the hollow places her grandfather warned of, ancient catacombs that breathe when people die above them. Her phrase appears not only in Mariani's 1947 notes, but in a 1928 parish chronicle about omens before earthquakes. To the villagers, the ground itself had a second appetite. It swallowed what was meant to stay buried elsewhere. A year later, British engineers inspecting the same fields under post-liberation authority logged periodic soil displacement and subsidence without seismic record. Photographs in the Royal Engineers Reconnaissance Series 4A show symmetrical depressions 2 meters wide, 6 feet apart, as though a line of heavy machinery had rolled beneath the surface. Officials annotated possible gas pocket, then closed the file. Yet in the hills, people began singing a lament with a strange rhythm, feet of iron, hearts of dust. They walk where candles rust. Ethnomusicologists later traced the melody to older funeral chants, but the community insisted the song began after the Americans fell. The alternating beats mirrored bootsteps, a cadence of remembrance disguised as prayer. By 1945, Allied occupation records noted farmers petitioning for compensation over damaged vineyards and nocturnal vibrations. The agricultural officer concluded it was soil compaction, but Captain Reeves, the same man who searched for Alcott's remains, appended a note in his own hand. No shell fragments, no bodies, only deep-clawed furrows in the limestone base. In children's drawings collected by Mariani's assistant that same year, parachutes descended from the night sky, while elongated shapes reached up from the ground. The caption in a child's scrawl read, "The sleeping ones woke." The Allied Psychological Warfare Division later circulated a memorandum on post-combat myths among civilian populations, classifying Sicily as a region showing persistent narrative contagion. The document advised commanders not to contradict the natives until morale stabilized. The choice of language neither confirming nor denying suggests a quiet recognition that disbelief was the safer policy. Among the villagers, the phrase "I sprofondati," the sunken ones, replaced the older term spiriti di terra. They said war had awakened them as thunder stirs the sea. One priest stopped ringing the bell after dusk because the echo answered from below. Parish records show his transfer a month later. The next priest resumed the bells without consequence. Meanwhile, the War Graves Commission listed 12 recovered parachutes with no corresponding remains. Lieutenant Commander Peter Haynes attributed it to wind shear, but in 1957, Colonel Perkins re-examined the data and noted canopies folded cleanly, webbing intact harness torn from anchor rings. The final paragraph of his report was physically cut away before microfilming. From that absence, another superstition took root. Parents warned children not to play in the old landing fields, calling them I lenzuoli bianchi, the white sheets. The phrase shifted in meaning over time. By the 1960s, it meant simply a subject you do not disturb. One elderly woman told a journalist those white sails were not cloth. They were mouths open to the sky. She collapsed before finishing the sentence. A U.S. chaplain attached to the 504th Regiment, Reverend Thomas Mallory, later wrote to the Bureau of War Records, describing partial bodies frayed as if by machinery. He requested permission to perform a blessing for peace with forces unseen. The request was denied. He left the clergy a year later, explaining in a final note that he had lost faith not in God, but in what shape creation truly takes beneath the plow line. Across the same territory, farmers began reciting a brief invocation before planting a "let the ground keep what it holds, and nothing that stirs return." The wording echoes medieval plague charms, but in this context referred only to the drop zones. Wine was poured into furrows to quiet them. Modern soil tests found iron traces unrelated to munitions residue of oxidized gear left to rust underground. A 1952 geological survey detected abnormal magnetism in those tracts west of Gela. Compasses wavered, though weather was calm. Engineer Marco Venturi blamed buried metal but added that the disturbance extends deeper than any recorded fragment depth. He warned of possible cavity collapse, then emigrated and refused interviews. By then, villagers had renamed the barren ridge La Spina, the spine. They said the earth there arched like a back before sleep. Crops would not grow, though rainfall matched surrounding fields. A midwife reported hearing breathing underfoot while walking that path. Her husband dug out of fear and found nothing but air pockets shaped like ribs. Later generations paved the road across it. When the U.S. Archives partially declassified Husky radio logs in 1961, one page listed unknown interference across 3 channels. The preserved waveform showed a rhythmic pulse every 2 seconds, described as metal on stone. Field officers marked it with the abbreviation CLWW, possibly the same word, clause from Alcott's final transmission 18 years earlier. That same year, a provincial theater troupe staged Gli Artigli nella Terra, the claws in the earth. The play retold the story of the lost paratroopers who found the heartbeat of stone. Locals refused to attend, warning it might call them back. On opening night, a 4-second tremor registered on the Palermo seismograph. The actors never performed again. By 1970, most references to Drop Zone West vanished from published histories. The 82nd Division's chronicle compresses the timeline to a single sentence: scattered landing. Successful regrouping. Colonel Morrison's field log, which once contained Alcott's journal, ends with the note: reports from the Sicilian site continue. No further correspondence. His heirs donated the collection after his death. One envelope remains sealed until 2045. In the villages, people still light candles each midsummer, inside hollow stones rather than graves. No prayers, no priest, only silence until the wax burns out. When asked why, they answer with the same words for those who did not land. The record divides like the soil it describes, typed coordinates on one side, whispered memory on the other. Each insists on its own truth, yet both point toward the same emptiness. Read together, they form a rhythm. Footsteps under the footnotes, an echo moving between the margins, repeating the single word that once crossed a broken radio clause. The military archives record the end of the search. Clearly, no survivors were found. Yet the oral record insists otherwise, but the drums still answered that night. The official after-action report, filed by Colonel Morrison on July 15, 1943, classifies Drop Zone West as concluded with losses within acceptable range. It states that all remaining personnel were accounted for by July 20th. The typed line ends neatly, the ink uniform, the language neutral. But another note handwritten on the back of the same page reads, 8 parachutes located. No bodies attached. Suggest area reinspection. The signature is faint, unverified, the date smudged. The next record appears 6 months later in a requisition form for unexplained equipment attrition. The form lists 17 rifles, 9 helmets, and 23 sets of jump boots registered as recovered in abnormal condition. No photographs accompany the entry, only a remark. Leather stiffened soles concave inward. The War Department's reply simply states, moisture damage dispose. The boots were buried in a trench near Gela. The trench is now an olive grove. Witnesses from the same region told a different story to the anthropologists who followed. They said the ground made a noise that night. Not thunder, not shellfire, but a voice under the stones. The farmers compared it to a drumbeat slow enough to count on one hand. When the paratroopers fell, they said the sound grew faster, as if the soil rejoiced. A 1944 memorandum from the Allied Medical Corps notes that several soldiers returning from the Western Front reported persistent tactile illusions. The line item cites sensation of soil movement while standing still. The medical examiner crossed out the initial diagnosis of vertigo and replaced it with psychosomatic disturbance, possibly mass suggestion. The next line is missing. Only one word remains, returned. In 1947, 3 years after the war's end, the U.S. Signal Corps attempted to remaster damaged field recordings from the Sicilian campaign. One of the reels marked Euro 217. Clause contained a short burst of interference followed by a steady pulse. The pulse measured precisely 64 beats per minute, the average human resting heartbeat. The operator's marginal note says, background noise identical to subterranean percussion. Possible shell casing vibration. At minute 2, the recording abruptly stops. The tape leader was torn as if removed by hand. Local testimony recorded that same year fills the gap in its own way. A shepherd named Terenzio Marino described standing on the ridge when the field trembled and the air turned hollow. He claimed to have seen parachutes still glowing from flare light sink instead of land. When asked what he meant, he said, "The cloth went downward. The men followed." His statement was transcribed without comment. The archives in Rome preserve a communication from the Carabinieri, dated 12th fall of July 1943. It lists the recovery of one unidentified object resembling military canopy, entangled with vines. The officer's report ends mid-sentence after the words, edges show, tearing inconsistent with. The rest of the page is blank. Villagers kept their own chronology in simpler language. They said that after the parachutes fell, the olive press never worked again. Each time the wheel turned, it produced not oil but mud that smelled like blood. The women stopped pressing olives and poured salt into the mill to cleanse it. The salt hardened into rock. The mill still stands, sealed shut. A cable from the British liaison officer at Trapani to Allied headquarters reads request clarification on subterranean tremors reported by local engineers. Believed natural. Recommend suspension of excavation pending stabilization. The follow-up telegram is missing. A later index shows its reference number reassigned to an unrelated shipment manifest. One oral fragment collected by Mariani's assistant offers an image no document could print. They heard the soldiers singing under the earth. The villagers said they sang in English, but the words were wrong, as if the tune had learned itself without mouths. Children used to press their ears to the ground and hum along. The sound stopped when bulldozers came in 1950 to flatten the drop field. Workers complained that their engines stalled whenever they reached the center. The foreman filed no report. He told them to dig elsewhere. A debrief letter from Captain Reeves, dated 1945, includes an attached sketch of terrain contours. The sketch shows shallow depressions shaped like footprints, but arranged in a spiral pattern. His note, if natural formation, unexplained. The carbon copy of that letter held at Carlisle carries another edition in a second handwriting. Wind didn't make those. Analysts later confirmed the second hand was not Reeves's. The author remains unknown. Folklore insists that each depression was a doorway. The peasants claimed they led to an older world, a network under the hills where breath turns to stone. They said the men who fell disturbed a gate that had no hinges. According to one elder, the openings closed when the ground finished eating. Anthropologists mark such statements as metaphoric survival of ancient underworld myths. Still, the coordinates in her story match those on Reeves's map. A separate Allied air reconnaissance photograph, taken July 11, 1943, shows heat blooms along a line south of Salemi. The pattern does not correspond to fires or shell impacts. Analysts in 1944 labeled it lens artifact. In 1979, when infrared imaging became available, a technician reviewing the old negatives noticed faint linear trails connecting the heat points, each trail precisely the width of a human body. An unfiled telegram dated September 1943 from the 505th Intelligence Officer reads, "Local superstition spreading among troops claiming ground, emit sound of marching after midnight. Recommend rotational redeployment." The archive stamp cuts off the final words. The bottom edge of the paper was burned. Decades later, in 1963, the descendants of farmers who lived near Drop Zone West reported small cave-ins after heavy rain. The Civil Protection Service filled them with concrete. The work order includes a remark: old bones and canvas fragments found within cavity. Possible animal remains. No museum accession numbers exist for those fragments. The report's appendix page is missing entirely. In contrast, the oral history adds one final sound to the record. An old man told Mariani's students the ground was not taking them, it was giving them back. When pressed to explain, he said that after each rain, white shapes appeared just beneath the surface, soft as silk gone by sunrise. "We didn't touch them," he added. "They were still breathing." A post-war American historian, Dr. Clara Hensley, examined the surviving Allied documents in 1985 and noted a pattern of redactions always surrounding the same set of dates, July 9th through 12th. She concluded that certain non-combat losses had been omitted to preserve morale. Yet in her private notebook, discovered after her death, she wrote only one cryptic line: "If they were omitted, who kept counting them?" At roughly the same time, the Palermo Folklore Archive reopened Mariani's sealed box of notes. Inside was a transcript fragment labeled "Night of the Sleeping Field." The last line of the witness account reads, "When the music stopped, the ground spoke once more. The next page is gone." The index card attached to the folder simply says "Lost during restoration." A surviving British memo from the same year declares the area cleared of hostile forces. The ink bleeds on the final word, as if the typewriter ribbon snagged. Folded within the same file is a scrap of civilian correspondence, a thank you note from a Sicilian woman addressed to an unnamed captain. It reads, "For saving my son from the well. He said the soldiers below called his name. No official record mentions a rescue." The captain's identity remains unconfirmed. The archival silence deepens after that. Every attempt to verify casualties yields different totals. The Italian death registers list names that do not appear in Allied payrolls. The Allied rosters list men whose graves are empty. In the overlap, both lists mirror one another like reflections caught between glass and shadow. Folklore bridges the void with precision of its own. The villagers say that once every generation, the wind from the sea carries a low hum across the plain, a vibration felt more than heard. They call it Il Passo dei Dormienti, the March of the Sleepers. Those who have listened claim it fades the moment you acknowledge it. The rational call it coincidence, the faithful call it warning. Either way, it continues. In 1994, seismic monitors installed for civilian infrastructure detected irregular pulses beneath the old vineyard tracts, short bursts of movement evenly spaced. The technician who logged the readings noted they resembled footfalls at slow cadence. His supervisor filed the anomaly under equipment malfunction. The line below that classification has been erased. The two narratives remain incompatible. One concludes with closure, the other refuses it. The report says the operation ended successfully. The villagers say it never ended at all. Both claim to speak the truth. Between them stands the listener forced to decide which silence sounds more convincing, the official one printed in black ink, or the one that still trembles through the soil each summer when the wind returns from the sea. And somewhere within that silence, another fragment lingers, found on an unlabeled reel in the Signal Corps archive frequency. A. After 3 minutes of static, a faint human voice whispers one word before the tape cuts out: returned. The official reconstruction of Operation Husky portrays the Sicilian landings as the beginning of European liberation. The reports are neat columns of numbers, arrows on maps, the clarity of victory, written after the fact. Yet in the margins of those maps lies an unmapped corridor. On post-war migration charts drawn by the Allied military government, the sector west of Gela is marked only with a faint diagonal hatch and the words "terrain unstable." No civilian resettlement is documented there for nearly 2 decades. Agricultural census tables list empty rows where population figures should appear, as though the ground itself refused registration. Beneath those empty tables, another form of record continued: oral, rhythmic, devotional. The post-war generation of Sicilian fieldworkers developed a new harvest song, an unaccompanied chant that began, "One fell, two fell, the field kept count." Musicologists who collected it in the 1960s noticed that the melody moved downward, a sequence of descending intervals unlike traditional folk scales. They called it a negative hymn, a song shaped like a collapse. The 1946 letters of Sergeant Raymond L. Kessler, preserved in the War Letters Archive, add an American echo to the same descent. Stationed near Palermo after the invasion, Kessler wrote home, "Locals talk about the sleeping ground like it's alive. They leave food by holes in the soil. I think they're feeding moles, but they never say the word animals. They say guests." A month later, he added, "Sometimes I dream I'm walking on parachutes instead of dirt." His correspondence ends that year. He was declared non-combat deceased, cause unspecified. His file number aligns with the same batch of missing reports from Drop Zone West. In village ritual, the image of feeding the unseen persisted. Each spring, farmers left a bowl of oil and bread on the soil's edge, murmuring, "For those who do not hunger." Ethnographers catalogued this practice as a survival of Roman household rites, but the villagers dated it precisely to 1943. One elder told researcher Enzo Taviani, "The night they fell, the earth became a table." The reconstructed casualty list from U.S. Army Group Headquarters shows a column marked "Body Repatriated," and beside it, in 12 cases, the notation "Not applicable." The line spacing is identical to all others. Nothing distinguishes it except absence. These 12 are men without graves. The War Department's next publication corrects the figure by removing the category entirely. They vanish cleanly, no erasure marks, no acknowledgement, just absence formatted into order. At the same time, an obscure article appeared in La Voce del Popolo, July 1952, under the headline, "I 12 uomini bianchi, the 12 white men." The anonymous author claimed to have seen figures made of mist wandering the ridge at dusk. The article was dismissed as provincial superstition, yet the issue sold out in one day. Years later, when the newspaper archives were digitized, the microfilm of that edition showed an irregular density, dark patches across every paragraph containing a number. In the American South, far from Sicily, a spiritual circulated among black servicemen returning from Europe. Its refrain echoed the Sicilian chant almost perfectly. "One fell, two fell, the ground kept count." No composer is named. The song appears in the Freedmen's Bureau Supplementary Songbook of 1947, mislabeled as traditional. Scholars have traced its first appearance to a veterans' hospital in North Carolina. The patients who sang it belonged to the 82nd Airborne Division. None had served in the Pacific. The reflective symmetry of evidence tightens their official songbooks, mirroring field laments. Empty columns on American casualty forms aligned with unpopulated Sicilian census tables. Each absence faces another like opposing mirrors. Between them stands the suggestion of continuation, a rhythm neither archive can silence. In 1958, an Italian engineer conducting groundwater surveys drilled into the old field near Salemi. His bore log notes rapid pressure change at 4.3 meters, followed by hollow resistance resonance like drum. The drill pipe sheared. He described the sound as a slow vibration, continuing for several seconds after stoppage. His supervisor ordered the site sealed. A year later, local boys claimed to hear music rising from the capped borehole at dusk, low metallic, almost percussive. The story spread as La Musica della Terra. An article in the Palermo Herald attempted to explain it as wind resonance. Its editor received an unsigned correction written in English, "No wind that night. It beats when the ground is still." The handwriting, later compared by a linguist, bore striking similarity to Alcott's known script. The editor destroyed the letter, calling it a prank of ghosts. American archival records from 1960 mention a map overlay number 42, unverified subterranean cavities. The overlay depicts a branching pattern beneath the western Sicilian plain, traced by infrared data. A marginal note reads, "Lines correspond roughly to 82nd Airborne scatter route." A following memo advises, "Do not include in public documentation classified geophysical interference." This directive stands out not for what it says, but for its phrasing. Geophysical interference, not anomaly, not myth, and interference as if the land itself were a signal crossing theirs. Meanwhile, back in Sicily, villagers continued a yearly procession from the church to the old drop field. They carried no cross, no icon, only 12 white kerchiefs. At the edge of the field, they laid them in a circle and poured wine at the center. The youngest participant recited "Sleep until called." When asked by visiting anthropologists who they prayed for, one answered simply, "For those whose names were translated." The expression puzzled the translators, translated, not lost. The implication, the men had changed languages, not disappeared. American chaplains stationed in post-war Europe collected numerous soldier dreams. A recurring motif appears in the 1946 to 1952 archive under Dream Recall Combat Associated. In one, a paratrooper reports being unable to find his shadow after landing. In another, the soldier says he hears a counting voice from below. The patterns parallel the civilian spirituals as if dream and hymn were mirror languages. When the chaplains presented these accounts at a psychology conference in 1953, the transcript records laughter from the audience. The moderator ends with "War makes poets of us all." The mirror, however, keeps doubling. In the 1970s, construction workers digging near the ridge unearthed fragments of rusted harness rings fused to rock. The Provincial Museum cataloged them as agricultural remains. During cleaning, one fragment released a faint rhythmic tapping when struck a hollow resonance at 64 beats per minute. The curator sealed it in a glass case. On humid days, condensation forms on the inside of the glass. Visitors describe it as breathing. Local priests incorporated that rhythm into their requiem masses during All Souls Week. The organists struck a pedal note in slow repetition, 1 beat per second, the same measured pulse from the signal corps reel. Parishioners said it made them feel the ground listening. None of them knew the number's military origin. Across the ocean, in an American veterans newsletter, a letter to the editor appears in 1979. To whoever served Sicily. 1943. Do you still hear it? It's under the floorboards when I close my eyes. The letter is unsigned. The editor added a note, possibly metaphorical. By the late 20th century, historians sought to reassemble both kinds of evidence, the disciplined precision of the archive and the ungoverned persistence of voice. A comparative study by Dr. Paolo Venti in 1992 placed official Allied records beside collected testimonies, noting near-perfect inversions where the military said all accounted for, the villagers said all remembered, where the army wrote no survivors were found. The oral record insisted none were lost. The symmetry, he argued, suggested a closed circuit of memory, two sides reflecting one another endlessly. 3 years later, Venti drowned off the coast of Mazzara while photographing the seabed. His last camera reel showed lines in the sand, 12 depressions evenly spaced. Back in Gela, a group of local students formed a folk ensemble named I Dormienti, the Sleepers. Their debut song sampled fragments of wartime Morse code into percussion. The refrain repeated, "We are counted, we are counted." A visiting ethnographer asked why they chose that lyric. The lead singer replied, "Because the wind told us to keep the number right." No one outside the village understood what number he meant. Meanwhile, the Italian Geological Survey updated its maps, again marking the ridge as stable. But when scanned for digital publication, the image file displayed a faint watermark not present on paper, the outline of 12 parachutes descending in formation. Technicians blamed a scanning glitch. They rescanned twice. The watermark remained. The digital archivist added a note in the metadata possible ghost artifact. The correspondence between forms of knowledge map and chant radio and prayer tightens until neither can dismiss the other. The more the reports insist on conclusion, the more the folklore produces continuation. Every effort to seal the story seems to generate another echo. The soil remains both evidence and instrument. It records footsteps, repeats heartbeats, turns frequency into rhythm, converts static into hymns. In the late 1990s, a hydrophone experiment conducted near the old field recorded faint subsonic oscillations. The waveform resembled the opening bars of the Sicilian harvest song, inverted its melody rising instead of falling. The scientist who analyzed it described the pattern as a pulse folding inward on itself. He published one line before funding was withdrawn. Sound may serve as the memory of matter. At the turn of the century, the church near Salemi restored its bell silent since 1943. When the bell tolled, villagers claimed it rang twice each time, once above, once below. The priest called it acoustic reflection. The congregation called it proof that the sleepers still answered. One parishioner recorded the sound on a handheld cassette. When played backward, the bell produces 12 tones, spaced evenly, no echo, just count. The archive has no section for resonance. Yet between its carbon copies and microfilms, something continues to respond. The official maps align with unrecorded songs. Lost names reappear as rhythms. Sealed letters hum faintly when handled. Fact reflects folklore, the way a mirror reflects light, unchanged, reversed, impossible to occupy. Perhaps that is where truth hides now, not in belief or record, but in the narrow distance between them. A geography of echo, a ledger written on both sides of the same sheet. The American reports call it unexplained interference. The villagers still call it the breath of the sleepers. Both in their own languages mean the same thing: something continues beneath us keeping count. The surviving files end without ceremony. There is no final statement, no concluding order. Only the last clean page of a typewritten report and the notation. Subject closed. The absence feels deliberate, as if the story were folded shut before the ink dried. Yet the silence inside those folders carries weight, the weight of something still waiting to finish its sentence. From that silence begins the echo. It arrives first in the smallest form, an unmarked reel of magnetic tape found in a signal core box labeled miscellaneous field audio. The reel is fragile, oxidized, nearly translucent. When played, it produces 31 seconds of nothing. Then, faintly, a pulse, one beat, then another, steady human, impossible to locate. The technician who listened described it in the margin log as drum far below. After the 30th beat, the tape breaks. No one spliced it again. The war diaries preserved in Carlisle still carry traces of this same rhythm, scattered through entries separated by years. Reeves wrote, "The ground is never still at night." Mallory wrote, "The prayers keep tempo with what I hear outside the tent." Even the geologist Venturi, a civilian, scribbled on the edge of his survey. There's pressure under the silence. Each voice becomes another strike on the same invisible drum. And then there is the river. The ancient maps name it the Beliche, though older villagers call it Il Fiume Cavo, the hollow river, because it disappears underground before reaching the sea. When Allied engineers diverted its course in 1943 to flood the German defenses, they noted unexpected backflow. The redirected water vanished into the hills for 2 days, only to reemerge miles away through fissures near the old drop zone. When it resurfaced, the current carried fragments of canvas and one broken dog tag reading Alcott Jr. No corrosion. The letters still legible. The tag now rests in a museum drawer marked unverified. Local accounts say the river still murmurs differently near the bend where it surfaced that year. Children who bathe there hear a dull resonance when they submerge their ears, like someone tapping on distant metal. Divers report no source. The water itself seems to breathe in pulses. Each echo arrives in groups of 12. Those who count aloud claim the 13th never comes. In 1947, when Mariani's assistant DeLuca transcribed her final interviews, she underlined a phrase that would later become a village refrain. They went down singing, and the earth kept the tune. Beneath it, she added her own note in pencil. I can still hear it at night. Same rhythm as a heart slowed by fear. 2 years later, her handwriting reappears on a different scrap of paper found inside Mariani's effects after his death. The soil remembers in sequence. No one knows how her words reached there. The church bell returned to sound once more in the 1960s, when new priests reopened the chapel near Salemi. Its first toll cracked the bell. The fracture divides the bronze cleanly through the maker's mark. Instead of melting it down, the villagers chose to keep it suspended, struck each year on July 9th. When struck, it gives 2 tones, one clear, one muted. Recordings confirm that the second tone reverberates below the human auditory range, a subsonic vibration traveling through the ground rather than the air. The priests call it the answer. That same year, an American journalist visiting the site noted in his travel diary, "At sunset, the wind carries a pulse you can mistake for artillery if you don't know history. It happens every 30 seconds, and when you stop listening, it continues inside your chest." He did not publish the note. It remained folded in the back of his passport found after his death. In 1976, the same pattern appeared again, this time in the instruments of seismologists studying low-frequency tremors across the Mediterranean basin. Their sensors near Gela detected repetitive beats spaced exactly 1 second apart, amplitude minimal, but consistent. One technician annotated the graph, too rhythmic to be tectonic. Another added possible mechanical interference source unknown. The line fades after 48 hours of data replaced by the phrase recording interruption. The folkloric layer follows that interruption with its own response. A recorded prayer from that decade includes the verse, "The earth turned in its sleep, and those within whispered Amen." The cadence matches the seismograph rhythm. Linguists classify it as coincidence. The villagers say it is the ground saying grace. As decades pass, each attempt to restore order only restores the pattern. The documents fill, then empty, like the tide. The same words reappear across languages, breath count drum silence. Scholars who examine them speak unconsciously in measured pauses, as if keeping time with something older than speech. Even now, when the field near Salemi is plowed, the tractors sometimes stall at regular intervals, engines cutting off every 12 seconds. Mechanics can find no fault. The farmers no longer measure those gaps. They let the machines rest in the rhythm until the engine restarts itself. Inside the archives, pages behave similarly. The ink on certain lines fades faster than others, always those containing numbers. When viewed under ultraviolet light, faint traces of circles appear 12 again, each encircling a missing word. One archivist describing this to a colleague wrote, "It's as if the paper remembers what was once written, but chooses not to reveal it." She resigned a week later. Through these accumulations, the two worlds documented and spoken begin to fuse. The historian listens to the tape of silence and hears a drum. The villager hears the drum and speaks of a record. The same phenomenon seen from either side reflects its opposite. Fact mirrors folklore, until neither word retains its edge. They collapse into each other, forming one long resonance that neither can own. A folkloric refrain closes that space. It appears in every generation's retelling. The drums kept answering. Sometimes it changes form. The river still breathes, or the bell replies twice, or the dream remembers its dreamer. But the structure never changes, an act then a response, a sound then its echo, a call then silence, silence then reply. In 1983, when the U.S. Army Historical Division conducted its final audit of Sicily operations, the lead archivist attached a handwritten summary, "No further evidence available." All lines accounted for. Underneath in pencil, someone else added, "Not all lines end." The handwriting does not match any member of the staff. The annotation was never erased, only blacked over. Under the right light, it can still be read. By the time the new millennium arrived, Drop Zone West existed only as coordinates on forgotten maps. The vineyards returned. The air smelled of salt again. Tourists driving the coastal road saw nothing unusual except an occasional flash of reflected sunlight off the old war memorial. But those who stopped and stood quietly said they could hear it, the faint percussion beneath the wind, a steady drumbeat pacing the horizon. No one records it. Everyone who hears it agrees not to. To describe it would make it end. At dusk, when the light turns the soil to bronze, villagers still walk the ridge and stop where the old olive mill once stood. They face west toward the sea, count 12 breaths, and wait for the echo. The first time it comes from far away, the second closer, the third inside the chest. They bow their heads and let the silence close over the rhythm like water over a stone. The field becomes an instrument tuned to absence. One final document completes the circle. It is undated, unsigned, found in the back of a declassified folder labeled "Non-Combat Losses." The sheet contains a single sentence typed in uneven ink. They are not beneath us. We are above them only for a while. The last word trails off into a faint mark resembling a heartbeat. On the reverse side, pressed into the paper, is the outline of a thumbprint. Analysis identifies no match. No one wrote again. But the drums kept answering. The bell still replies twice when struck. The river still hums against its stone bed. The air over the field still holds the pulse of 12. And when the wind passes through the vineyards, it carries a sound neither record nor legend can explain, the slow, patient rhythm of something counting in the dark, waiting for silence to finish its song. The last time the archive was opened, it was for cataloging, not investigation. A young researcher from Palermo University assigned to digitize the Morrison collection found the sealed envelope that had remained untouched since 1956. The wax had cracked. The paper was brittle. Inside were only two objects, a fragment of soil wrapped in linen and a handwritten note. The note read, "Return this when the silence stops." There was no signature, no date. Laboratory analysis identified the soil as consistent with the western Sicilian ridge near Gela, compacted at a depth of 4 meters, exactly where the drop zone once lay. The Morrison archive is now stored at Fort Bragg's Airborne Museum under restricted access. A copy of the note sits in a sealed display marked unverified material. Visitors walk past it daily without noticing. The staff maintain that it hums faintly when the room is empty, though no recording has ever confirmed this. Across the sea in Palermo, the Mariani papers remain incomplete. The fire that destroyed his wire reels spared one box of handwritten transcripts. The final page in his surviving notebook ends with a sentence partly erased by smoke. They asked for names, but the ground gave them numbers. It is the same phrasing found later in Allied Signal Corps files describing interference frequencies. The archivists who compare them point out the symmetry, but do not comment further. Of Captain Reeves, there is no further trace beyond his Jeep, found in 1945, engine cold key in ignition. The after-action search described abandoned vehicle, no footprints in mud. The vehicle's tires had sunk deep, as if the earth softened only beneath them. The last entry in Reeves's personal log reads, "Hearing them again tonight, same interval, slower now." His family requested reclassification to missing non-combat. The request was granted. The geological records, the folklore transcripts, the coded letters all now reside in separate institutions. No one has attempted to unify them since the early 2000s, when the last comparative project quietly ended. The reason, according to a memo from the Italian Ministry of Culture, was lack of conclusive evidence and excessive pattern coincidence. Yet each archive maintains its own inexplicable residue. The microfilm from Fort Bragg occasionally warps. The Palermo audio tapes emit a pulse on playback even when no reel spins. The museum attendants shrug. The technicians replace wires. The sound returns anyway. What remains clear is this. The physical evidence of the drop is smaller than the story that followed. A few torn parachutes, 12 missing men, a broken bell, and a silence that refuses to stay silent. Each generation has tried to bury it beneath new explanations, geological, psychological, folkloric, but the echo continues through every attempt, changing form, never volume. In the newest testimonies recorded by journalists during anniversary commemorations, the language has softened. The villagers no longer speak of monsters or sleepers. They speak of presences. Sometimes one man said when the wind comes from the sea, the vines bend as if saluting. His grandmother once told him that the paratroopers never left, that they are the breath between the stones. When he walks the ridge at dusk, he says, he feels his heartbeat slow until it matches something larger beneath his feet. It's not fear, he said. It's counting. On the American side, the veterans who survived Sicily and lived long enough to tell their stories mention dreams that return near the same date each year. A shared image, the sound of boots on dry soil, and a faint metallic drumming far away. One described it as the ground marching for us. Another said he sometimes woke to the rhythm of a bell he had never heard in life. It rings twice, he said, once in memory, once in warning. Every archive, whether official or local, carries its own echo of that repetition. The Fort Bragg curators note that humidity sensors in the Morrison room trigger at 12-minute intervals even when climate controls are off. The Palermo archivists say the floorboards under the Mariani shelves vibrate slightly every July. The museum visitors describe hearing something they cannot name. The scientists who check the sensors find no error. The pattern continues. By now, no historian pretends to resolve it. The documents have been cross-checked, the folklore indexed, the frequencies plotted, and still the same cadence returns, steady, patient, disinterested in interpretation. What began as a wartime anomaly has become something larger, a conversation between the living and the recorded, the remembered and the erased. The echo has learned endurance. Each symbol introduced across decades, drum river bell breath, feeds the same motif. The drum beats beneath the surface of every silence. The river still folds back into its own current. The bell tolls twice for every loss, one tone above, one below. And the breath, slow, collective, unending, fills the space between fact and belief, between what was written and what was only whispered. Each is a form of response. Together they complete the call that began the night the parachutes fell. In one of his final lectures before his death, Dr. Venti, the scholar who drowned near Mazzara, spoke of this echo not as mystery but as memory. A story, he said, is not a sequence of words. It is a vibration that refuses extinction. The recording of that lecture survives. At its end, after his final sentence, there is a faint rhythmic noise picked up by the microphone. 12 beats, measured and slow. The transcript notes unidentified background sound. The modern custodians of these archives, detached and secular, rarely mention that rhythm aloud. Yet when they meet historians, folklorists, archivists, they all use similar language the documents breathe. They say it quietly, without irony, as if reporting weather. They do not mean it metaphorically. They mean that whenever the records are handled, a subtle warmth seems to move through the paper, like a pulse that has learned to live inside ink. There is still no consensus on what happened on that July night in 1943. The military maintains that the records are complete. The local historians maintain that the story is not. Between them lies a field of silence where both are right and neither sufficient. Maybe the truth is not an event at all, but an echo, something that repeats until we learn to listen differently. The official story ends with 12 missing soldiers. The folklore begins with 12 who stayed behind. Both use the same number. Both are counting. And somewhere between their ledgers lies a space wide enough to hold the question no report could phrase if the ground remembers rhythm. Who taught it to keep time? Maybe the paratroopers didn't disappear. Maybe we did. Maybe every record we keep is just an outline around the silence that replaced us, and every echo we hear is the world reminding us that absence is never empty. It's merely full of memory we can't translate. Perhaps history itself is the drum still answering patient, unending, keeping the tempo long after we've left the field. The wind moves through the vines again tonight. The bell replies twice. The river hums its low refrain. The documents wait in their boxes, breathing quietly in rhythm. Somewhere in that cadence is the pulse of everything we've tried to name and everything we've failed to keep. The silence holds both. You've just listened to another file from Shadow Stories. If you want to hear what history still remembers when the drums stop, subscribe and listen for the next echo.